don't even know where to start because I was legitimately asking the question if we wanted to kind of talk about like the realignment or the Big 12, just kind of previewing the Big 12. What's kind of caught your attention when it comes to college sports news? Like, what's been the thing that has been most interesting to you?
Other than the fact that the Pac-12 is cooked.
Sure.
Yeah. It's the thing I've been saying about the Pac-12 guys is that they're basically the Atlanta Falcons blowing a 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl because, look, they had every resource, every piece available for them to win against the Big 12, so to speak, and they end up losing. And look, that's what this is. This really is a Game of Thrones. It is a zero-sum game. We hear a lot of words like merging. Merging isn't exactly possible when you need a centrally located office, right? Somebody has to win here. The Big 12 and the Pac-12 couldn't have merged. One of them had to win, and that's, Mountain West and Pac-12 can't merge. One has to win. There has to be a central office and everything else. So it's a zero-sum game. And, I think the ACC and the Big 12, it's sort of like Game of Thrones where there's going to be the two power conferences. There is the two power conferences and eventually probably a third. And we'll see, again, what ends up happening. But right now you've got the two power conferences and these two mid-conferences with the Big 12 and the ACC in terms of what those conferences are taking in on an annual basis in terms of their television revenue.
Yeah. Ari, I'm glad you brought up television revenue because that was the next point I wanted to talk about because you're talking about kind of winning and losing, and I know a lot of people get focused in on that, especially folks that aren't sickos and tied into college football, and college sports in general. But can you lay out for, I guess, the layman how the TV contracts play into this? Because I was reading earlier that the Big Ten would not have accepted Oregon and Washington if it wasn't for Fox paying out some more money for their television rights.
Right. The television revenue is driving this entire situation here. And, there are people that are complaining about the landscape of college athletics right now and how it's been taken over by television networks. And, and do they have the best interests of the sport in mind? Now, I'd argue that they do, just based on the fact that, they're driven by profits and they understand from a profitability standpoint what's going to make them money based on how many consumers are going to tune in. And so part of the super power conference deals we're having here now has to do with fan behavior and consumption and wanting to see better matchups. And that's what essentially our overlords of these ESPN and Fox have dictated and decided. So when you look at the actual math, guys, when Texas and OU left, the SEC was in line to get a deal with ESPN that beyond what they already signed, but adding Texas and OU, you're looking at somewhere between 70 and 100 million per year in terms of television revenue. Now, there are other factors that go into the total take in terms of, payouts from the college football playoff, payouts from the NCAA tournament, which are all obviously to be determined. But that's the gist of it. Between 70 and 100 million is where it's going to go to. That's per school. The Big Ten, after adding UCLA and USC, has the exact same situation. They're going to make anywhere between 70 and 100, depends on who you've read and what information they have, and who knows. At the end of the day, you'll get to pay out every year, and we find out exactly how much is made. But anywhere between 70 and 100, okay? So the Big 12 and the ACC are pretty close. The Big 12 is going to be between 30 and 35 million, and the ACC will be between, let's say, 32 and 37 million. Again, there's factors in play. So clearly a lot less than the SEC and the Big 10. That was always going to be the case, because the ACC was locked into this deal through 2036. The Big 12 gets to cash in again in 2031. So, 2036 is still 13 years away. Kevin, you and I, our kids will be graduated high school by the time that ACC deal is up, just to give, just to give context there, right? That is a long time. So that's why Florida State is so upset. And then when you want to go even further, guys, so let's just say where the Big 12 and the ACC are, that's kind of been where most programs have been, the Big Ten topping out closer to 40 to 50. And again, so 30 to, let's say 30 to 50 has been the range within the Power Five. And when you look at the Mountain West or the American Athletic Conference or Conference USA or any of these other formerly Group of Five conferences, they're at about $5 million a year. So we see why SMU obviously wants to get out. Now, look, they're going to take less of a pay to get into a bigger conference because they want to be contenders and want to be playing with these conferences, but also because of the end goal of eventually getting full payouts. But that's why when you look at like say BYU and UCF and Cincinnati and Houston that aren't going to be full members over the next couple of years of the Big 12. I mean, guys, we're talking about a substantial increase in television revenue. So the landscape is bad, obviously, for the Big 12 and the ACC moving forward, but it's a lot worse for everybody else. And that's where we talk about the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And certainly that's the case for the Big 10 and the SEC. But even more so, again, when you factor in the drop-off between those four programs or four conferences that are making, let's say, $30+ million a year, whereas everybody else is around the $5+ million a year range.
Ari Temkin of Sirius XM Sports joining us here on the Get Right. You can find him on Twitter at Ari Sports. Real quick, before we kind of get into a couple of things as we get closer to the start of the college football year, for you, where does this having all begun from? Obviously, the acceleration of all of this over the last several years in terms of realignment. But for you, what was the inflection point of where things started to turn for you when it comes to the big business of college football, specifically when it comes to realignment as you start to kind of look back on it now?
Kev, it's a great question. I was in Austin working for 104.9 The Horn and covering the Longhorns when this was all going down.
And I was listening to you.
And I remember it. And it was essentially third-tier rights. So the Big 12 was the only conference in the Power 5 that was allowing its member institutions to retain their Tier 3 rights. Okay, and that essentially is what kept Texas and OU at that time in the conference. And everybody, Longhorn fans now will say like, "Oh, you're blaming us." No. All the Big 12 teams got their Tier 3 rights. Now, Texas famously went to Texas A&M and said, "Hey, we got this opportunity to launch a Longhorn network. What if we go in this together?" Texas A&M famously turned it down. Probably more nuance to the story, but for the sake of timing, that's what happened. And so when ESPN then comes to Texas and says, "Here, have $500 million, and we're going to take your Tier 3 rights," what are they supposed to do? Say, "No, thanks. We're all set." So, there's blame on Texas, but also not in a way that's fully what were they supposed to do? Not take the money? And that was a bad deal for ESPN, but my God, was that still a good deal for Texas? But ultimately, that's Larry Scott wanted the Pac-12 to add Oklahoma and add Texas and maybe even more, but they didn't because of the Tier 3 rights. And because that contract had been signed, Texas is not giving that money back. So they were going to be able to land back with the Big 12 with the Tier 3 rights and that contract in hand to launch the Longhorn Network. So Longhorn Network is what started this whole thing. Again, not like a vitriolic blame on Texas. It just is what it is. They wanted to partner with A&M. A&M didn't. ESPN handed them a big check, and that rightfully so gave them the opportunity eventually when that money dries up, which obviously that's happening. Now you get to a situation where you want to continue to play at the highest level of college football and earn the most money you can possibly make. So that's what led them to the SEC. So this thing all started back when Larry Scott wanted to add Texas and Oklahoma, and Texas and Oklahoma didn't go because they're Tier 3 rights.
All right, I thought you were going to be a smart A like me and say all the way back in the 80s when the colleges started getting TV money to broadcast games.
Oh, yeah, you're not wrong, Reg. You're not wrong at all. That was OU and Florida State that sued the NCAA, and yeah, you're 100% correct. Ultimately, when schools could retain their own rights to sell their television rights, which obviously makes total sense. Ultimately, this is what it was going to you can go back now and look. It's like this was going to happen. You're going to have a consolidation of power. You're going to have programs that didn't want, Iowa State to be lumping into the success of a brand of what Texas brings to the table, and that's what you have. But I also think guys, the Lakers and the Cowboys can't just play themselves every week, right? Those are the two biggest brands in their respective sports. But you need the Jacksonville Jaguars. You need the smaller markets. You need the entire country to be engaged. And I think that's the worry with what's happening here is the Cowboys just can't play themselves every week. We know they're a huge draw. And they're the Cowboys, but the Lakers need the Utah Jazz. The Cowboys need the Jaguars, right? They need the entire country fans to be engaged, and that's the concern here. Of you just consolidate power and you're constantly consolidating power, and it's okay, Ohio State and Texas are playing every week, and Alabama's playing Georgia every week, and Like, those are great games and great matches, don't get me wrong, but ultimately you do need them to play other teams and have interest from those fans in those other teams.
Yeah, Ari, that was going to be my question. Like, how far can this go? Because it feels like college football has added another existential crisis on the horizon outside of the one that we seem to be forgetting, which is the fact that they're not paying their labor at all. But outside of that, like, how far can this go? Because I think there's a lot of folks that look up and go, we might end up with NFL light.
Yeah, and by the way, for the people that are like, they are paying their labor now, no, they're still not. The colleges aren't. It's the businesses around those colleges that are. And by the way that the administrators are taking it to Washington right now, they're going to end up really regretting going to Washington with this, because ultimately it's going to end up with college athletes being deemed as employees, and now we're opening up a whole new can of worms with that. So good job by the NCAA and its member institutions to go to Washington and try to get some legislation passed, which will eventually happen in the next few years. And when that happens, athletes will be deemed employees, and then, yeah, all bets
And then
are
you
off.
need more TV money to make to justify this, right?
And then you're going to actually have to pay them, aside from the money they're going to be getting from NIL. So, yeah. But I digress. Your question was, I'm sorry, you got me on that tangent.
Yeah, no, like no, but yeah, and you know what? I'm glad that we went there. No, just like, how far can this possibly go? Because again, we're seeing power consolidated, and one of the things you're talking about is the market forces that create the TV contracts are so lucrative that then there's consolidation. Like, how far can this possibly go?
Yeah, no, Reg. I mean, I think if you're looking at this realistically, like, obviously I'm a fan of the Big 12. I host a talk show on Big 12 radio, and I went to Kansas, and so you went to K-State, right? Like, we all have our allegiances to different universities across. We don't have to mention where Kevin went.
Relax, Ari.
You can spell it if you want, KG.
You were doing a lot. You were doing very well until you decided to take it there. Now let's relax. Let's relax.
Misery. Is that how you spell it?
No, that would be Mizzou. I'm not gonna say anything else disparaging about your university. God-forsaken school.
I appreciate you, buddy. No, but I mean, like, again, inevitably, like, the Big 12 has an expiration date too, and so too does the ACC, right? So it's just going to, like, they talk about money being dried up, right? Like, the Pac-12's problem was that they won a TV deal and there just wasn't money from networks, and yet, like, right, ESPN lays off a bunch of people and then they pay Pat McAfee $4 million. Like, you pay for what you want. Like, the Pac-12 made the excuse of, well, the money was dried up. That's why there was no market. Well, that's not – I mean, they're still going to pay for what they want. If the SEC deal was up, I could – ESPN would have found a way to find the money to get the SEC deal done. You know what I mean? So, like, there will continue to be this idea of, like, well, the market's drying up for sports rights. There's so much. And yet, like, all it is just a larger consolidation into these two conferences. So, we'll see. Now, look, the grant of rights that the ACC is locked into is the same grant of rights, and Dennis Dodd from CBS wrote about this, that the Big 12 designed, that Bob Bowlesby designed, which was, like, designed extremely well in order to not get out of it. The University of Texas is one of the great law schools, has some of the best lawyers in the country, and they're paying $50 million to get out of their grant of rights 1 year earlier. $50 million. The University of Texas could not figure out a legal recourse to get out of their grant of rights.
They also like wasting money, though.
OU has to pay that same 50, right? So that's 1 year. They're each paying they're paying $100 million total, $50 million each. 1 year. Guys, there's 13 years left in the ACC deal. So Florida State seems very confident they can get out. I don't know how, but maybe they will. And ultimately, I think there's interest in North Carolina. Is it like the Big Ten? And I think you're going to basically have a war between the top brands, quote unquote, within the ACC, Florida State, and North Carolina, and Clemson, and maybe Miami. And I know people are saying, well, those teams don't win as much, and it doesn't matter, right? It's about what kind of an audience can you command. That's the idea of brand. How well you're recruiting, and those things matter. And so then, you're looking at a situation where you're going to have the clear power too with those brands in it, and then. Again, a Big 12 that will probably take on more ACC teams. That's just going to be extremely scattered and a clear second tier. And this is, you could really start to extrapolate this out if you want and talk about a relegation system where you're starting to now justify earning more money in television revenue because you're better at football and performing at a higher level. Where you're kind of going up and down the rungs with Conference USA and the $5 to $10 million they'll earn over the next decade on a per year basis, and then to 30 to 40 million for the Big 12 level, and then up and up and up and up. I mean, you could certainly project that that's a situation that that could end up becoming college football, some sort of a European soccer relegation system.